My name is Kisa Harley, and I'm the Education and Curatorial Initiatives Manager at Hanford Mills Museum. And I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to the mill for those of you who might not be familiar. We're a historic mill site, and we're located in a small hamlet called East Meredith, New York. We're in the eastern central part of the state, or for those of you who are familiar with local geography, we're about 10 miles east of Oneonta. The sawmill at Hanford Mills was built in 1846, and the businesses continued to operate until the mid-1960s. And the greatest expansions at the mill took place between 1860 and 1900 under DJ Hanford and his sons Will and Horace's ownership, and that's why we're called Hanford Mills Museum. The businesses included a grist mill, woodworking shops, and eventually a retail shop, and the family also operated a dairy farm. Today, Hanford Mills Museum is a historic mill site where we still use a water wheel and steam plant to run sawmill, grist mill, and woodworking machines. And you can see our mission here on the screen. This was updated in 2010 when we really started to focus more on topics connected to the ideas of sustainability. And now I'm going to turn things over to Liz Callahan, our Executive Director, to start tonight's program.
Thank you, Kisa. Good evening, I'm Liz Callahan, and I'm the Executive Director of Hanford Mills Museum, and so excited about our InterActions series. And I'd like to first acknowledge some of the support that's made this InterActions series possible. Hanford Mills has been able to produce this series with a grant from the Creativity Incubator Project of the Greater Hudson Heritage Network and the New York State Council on the Arts. And we've done this series in collaboration with the Cooperstown Graduate Program, specifically Dr. Will Walker, who's going to be our moderator or facilitator this evening, and some of the graduate students he works with, including Anna Minabo, Shia Muggan, and Kirby Sondrio, and one of our former interns from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, Cerra Grantham. And without all of their input, I don't think we would have had such a successful series. So I'd like to acknowledge all of that hard work and creativity that's gone into this. And now I'd like to welcome ecologist Josh Cerra. He is an associate professor of landscape architecture at Cornell University, and he directs the Cornell Climate Change Garden, an interpretive research installation on Cornell's campus. His work explores landscape architecture, design strategies as they relate to New York waterways and climate change. But his experience is not limited to that. Josh has done a lot of field work in the past and has explored landscapes all over the country. And I think we'll be hearing about a variety of his experiences tonight. I'd also like to welcome Richard Kathmann. Richard is a native of East Meredith. His family has deep roots here. And I'd like to also acknowledge that Richard was Hanford Mills Museum's first executive director in the 1970s. But Richard went on to many other places and led nonprofits and museums, created art, and wrote and explored. But he has returned to East Meredith, and his art is inspired by his surroundings in the Northwest Catskills. And he is a landscape and abstract painter and lithographer. And we're going to hear and see a great deal about his wonderful work tonight as well. So we will start by hearing from Richard and then move on to Josh. Please do put your questions and comments into the Q&A. And after we've had each of their presentations, we will address those questions and have a conversation with them. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. Richard?
Good evening. I'm delighted to have had this preparation time for this virtual lecture. Liz and Keisha have been just wonderful to work with, and I'm delighted to have Will and Joshua participating with us. I'm very much about the Northwest Catskills. And I'll start with a meeting house about a couple of miles from East Meredith. The first slide, please. It's the West Courtright Center now. It was the Presbyterian church called West Church. And that slide is from a few days ago. So we're used to having goats and cows on the lawn, and it's a delight to have an organic farm right next to it. I live a half mile away from here. I grew up a couple of thousand feet from this building. And my talk is really about being a part of the Catskills and always thinking I'm in heaven here, except sometimes in early March. Next slide. This is about a 3-mile view from one edge of the Susquehanna and Delaware divide. And I can't point to that, but that summit is the other part of the divide. That divide snakes through this area. So the depth of this picture is about 3 miles, not including the far peak. That shaded area, left center, is a forest that I'm lucky enough to own with my brother, John, and I always say, how does a poor man own a forest? Well, if you inherit it, and then if you're old and have limited income, the STAR exemption program allows you to afford it. Next slide. Now we're looking west, again at the divide. We're in the upper shed. My place is where I live and where I walk through the woods every day, and walk the dirt road is just a half mile from the foreground of this screen. Next slide. It's cow country. And one can say that's threatened now, but cows and farmers really preserve this landscape. And it's distressing when a dairy farmer goes out of business because of market or some other economic conditions that keep them or not encourage them, but force them to leave. So I'm just wanting to remind us that those cows and those farmers are our first line of preservation of this landscape here in the Northwest Catskills. Next slide. I'm always out walking and I'm drawing in small notebooks. The image at top is of Hobart Township. Like West Courtright, they and many other places have a meeting house. That image in the lower left is their 1823 meeting house. A cow, of course, lower left. And then an idea for a painting that I haven't done yet, but the black windows against the white walls of the meeting house there in Hobart, mirrored against the Holstein, a white Holstein with black spots. She's in the foreground of the larger drawing. Next slide. So as a forest painter, I'm working on the upper ridges from about 1,500 feet to the top of the divide is around, runs from 22 to 23 plus 2,300 feet. And I'm showing that upper left view of late 19th century at Hanford Mills to show that in a way, first of all, the forest has increased and covers the land more. The lower left is a view of East Meredith Mountain, which is directly above Hanford Mills, but this is from the the east side, looking west. And lower right is the view from my window, my studio window, up to the divide. Again, I'm in the Susquehanna watershed. Beyond that divide is the west branch of the Delaware, also upper. It's probably not more than 15 or 18 miles from the source of the Delaware as you cross and drop into that valley. And the notebook sketch is doodling as I look out my window of the studio at the yard and at the field systems. Next slide. So I sometimes advertise my practice as 10 studios, 50 years. Well, now it's 60 years. And the postcard is from a show at Rochester, not Rochester, but Roxbury Arts Group in 2014. That at lower left was a studio I had until recently, I had for over 10 years in Delhi on Main Street. And the image, a good sized charcoal drawing measuring 44 inches wide by 77 inches high, is an image I got from the upper Delaware watershed, just over the ridge from where I'm living. You have to hike for a while to get to the precipice that drops into the river valley. Next slide. So I'll look at the next slide, which is my woods, and it reflects a view of my woods. I did this in 2007 with lithographer Tim Sheasley at Corridor Press. It's a good size image. It's a diptych. The whole thing is 30 inches by 45 inches. It's been good for my income, I should say, even with an addition of 10, and good for my reputation. But the important thing for me about the forest to say now is that reflects management of a forest that had, and it still does, that for 60 years has been used for timber, for firewood, and for maple sapping. And you see distance between trees because they're being cultivated or harvested to allow the younger trees to grow and in turn grow enough to be harvested. Next image. At the edge of these forests, you find volunteer apple trees. This particular beauty, and they can be gorgeous in the spring, these wild apples, these volunteers that are being encroached upon by the forest. So the reason there's a dead skirt beneath those vibrant blossoms is that surrounding trees are shading it and threatening its life. But it made a great image, and I work in the forest, but I also work the edges of the forest too, walking, just enjoying what I see, and then occasionally taking notes, then occasionally drawing and painting. The next slide. we'll show another apple tree. They're great beauties, even in winter. And don't miss the coyote in the lower right of that small painting. The image at right is a view of my forest, again, not very far from the sap house where I live. I live in a renovated sap house, the third generation that my family used in this forest. And again, it shows that kind of forest culture. Of course, no animals are grazing in there, and the crops are timber and firewood and maple sap. Of course, we've just finished a great maple sap season. It wasn't as great as I think the producers would have liked, and us consumers who are clamoring for. Next slide. I'm going to read this text. It's from John Berger, the great Italian writer and aesthetician. It's advice that I have internalized. I don't even think about it. The drawing is the text of that script from his book. I've forgotten the title at the moment, but I give a credit for it down here. The Sense of Sight. To look at everything which overflows the outline, the contour, the category, the name of what it is. All appearances are continually changing one another. And then I'll skip down. That is why looking is to recognize, enter a whole, identify an object or color or form is what visibility really reveals. What is the meaning to be found in the visible? A form of energy, continually transforming itself. So I'm continually about that business that he's describing. And it's light and energy that I represent. Next slide. So perhaps these are best interpreted as light and energy. A very quick sketch in the upper left. Lower left, a very quick view of the forest, basically focusing on the floor. You see, I don't go up much more than 8 or 10 foot on those trunks in the foreground. And then night skies. Lower right is evening, summer's day, early summer's day, and a few hours later, working from the porch of my sap house looking south. The next slide, please. Energy and light. The upper left shows the stumps remaining after 3 downed trees have been harvested for firewood. And at lower left and at right, I'm just thinking and feeling. Energy, form, light, and I love that exercise. I'm really a studio painter. I start outside. I say I have no imagination. I have to go out there to find something. But I don't, like plein air painters, I don't spend most of my production out there. I find it's too much energy, too much information to manage. So I come into the studio with the first views, like the ones you see. Next slide, please. So those sketches become paintings. In the mid 2000s, I was doing virtually all 12 inches square. It's a fairly fast format for me to begin and finish and then send off to market. Not that I have a huge market, but there is an interesting, should we say, a social economy here for registering, shall we say, your presence and your skills. Next slide. This is from my forest. Interestingly enough, it was celebrating the green because I was just back from a drawing and painting trip to New Mexico. And I'll have a short New Mexico slide when we finish this one. And I was really celebrating the light on green and how the sky and the water's edge peek through that. This one was a very successful painting. I'd like to brag, shall we say. It got the Woodstock School of Art Award at the quadricentennial exhibition celebrating the Hudson about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago. Next slide. Again, it's energy and light, and out of that comes the form. The two images on left are views from my sap house to the yard, which is basically the edge of the forest. I live in a yard that I call lovingly untended for a decade. So it has wonderful wild plant material. The one on the right is center of the forest. Next panel, please. Again, we're looking at light and we're looking at energy. The panel on the right is a small one, 6 inches square. The panel lower left is probably 14 inches square. I often work square. And the panel above is probably 12 inches square. The next image, please. So you work all summer, well, spring and summer in green, and you're really tired of it. And then comes fall foliage, and it's such a celebration. It doesn't last long, but at left is a view from my studio, and right is a view within the woods. And I just love the exercise of sketching quickly, perhaps drawing first and then oil sketching quickly, and then bringing those oil sketches into the studio where I may work on them through December, just, shall we say, following directions that and instincts that appear to me. The next slide, please. More drawings of the woods. I can't say I'm out there every day, but almost. Lower right is a beautiful view. I like the energy. Left-hand side, I like the energy and the fact of a wood pile appearing behind the trees. That's preparation for winter. And then upper right is the center of the woods. A study in light and energy. And I'm always interested in the forest floor It doesn't always appear in an image, but it always gets my attention, and I'm affected by the floor, the forms, and the color of the forest floor. Next image. This is the final image of Northwest Catskills. We'll go quickly to the Southwest, but the black and white painting is looking south at the divide from the West Church yard. Now that West Church is where we began this slideshow. And it began as a triptych. I do the center panel, then I go to the left and record that, and I go to the right of the center panel and record that. And in this particular case, I was teaching with Beth Furman, a very fine painter, and we had, shall we say, 12.5 students, and just having a good time, struggling to capture light. Lower left, a free drawing on handmade paper. I'd love to work on handmade paper and just let the pencil find its way. I'm, of course, looking at a forest as I'm drawing. And then a reminder, the last image in this slideshow, how beautiful it is. The shade, that's Courtright Creek, very close to the divide, probably not more than 3/4 of a mile. And that eventually arrives by joining other streams at the Susquehanna River near Oneonta.
Richard, 4 minutes.
Okay, let's do Southwest. There's text that anybody can see. Southwest Riparian Gallery Forest. A drawing that shows me looking at a diversion weir and the water control structures. Let's go through those images very quickly. Next slide. An impoundment feature. So it's more of diversion, and on those water control poured concrete walls, what I call museum quality graffiti. And notice in the background, upper right, a 1700s place called Rancho Luceros. We'll look at that right now if you'll give me that image. It's a beautiful place. I want the whole place preserved, including the water control structures, because above it to the west is the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Preserve. Go on, please. Next slides. This is that riparian gallery forest that I speak of, cottonwoods and other trees. Another slide of the forest. And some images that I bring home in the next slide. There's a cottonwood on the acequia system. And then I believe I have 2 more images. Well, this is my final slide. The forest, the cottonwood forest on the left on constructed panels, and then something nearby, a Indian paintbrush, beautiful desert plant. It's been a delight. Thank you for looking with me at the 2 places I'm working routinely, Northwest Catskills and the Southwest rivers.
Richard, thank you so much for sharing those beautiful images and your approaches to them with us. And I look forward to talking to you more about them after we hear from Josh. Josh, take it away.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that it really is a pleasure being here with you, Richard. And I know I enjoyed a lot of what you shared. It really is some tremendous work. And I want to thank you and all of those at Hanford Mills, Liz and Keisha, as well as Will, and everyone who's here today for an opportunity to share stories. And I think we're going to have an interesting combination of art and Richard, your career as an artist and mine as a scientist and designer. I think that there should be an interesting conversation that follows. So why don't I start by just sharing my screen. I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation. And this should work. Can everyone see it in sort of a slideshow mode? I can't see you guys. Richard, can you see that? Yes. Okay.
Yes,
well,
I can.
Okay, yes, great. Josh. Yep.
Okay. I was going to talk a little bit today about some of my work in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio. It's a project I've been developing at Cornell University for some time. It's a program that really seeks to provide teaching, research, and community benefits, and that's really our goal. Almost all of the images you'll see, all of the images you'll see here were created by students in the studio. And just for some really brief background, I don't want to take too long. I wanted to just, for those of you that have had design careers and those of you that have art careers, in a design studio, well, in a design program, you learn a lot of things about all kinds of technical topics and theory topics in other classes. And design is a practice. Landscape architecture is a practice. Like law or medicine or engineering, it's a degree that provides a path towards licensure. And so we need to practice. And that practice happens in the studio. It's an opportunity to try out, to apply some of the technical knowledge you've been developing in terms of site engineering and topographics, grading and drainage, representation, construction documentation, construction detailing, and then also some of the design theory that's out there, and that happens in the studio. So I usually start with this slide, and many of you have probably seen slides like this. This idea that our economy is embedded within our society, and our society is embedded within the planet. And this is actually provided. There's some. This image is provided by a number of resilience theorists, actually, who are grounded in the ecological sciences, where the theory of resilience began in the ecological sciences. And I just really appreciated that this was in the introductions to their chapter. And I have this slide as well that I want to share, just a quote from Kathman et al., who is quoting some other resilience theorists that are out there, that this idea that we must understand that our world and our region and our community really is composed of a social ecological system in which people, we depend on the ecosystems and the services that are provided by them. And the ecosystem itself, the ecosystems themselves are influenced to varying degrees by human activities. And so it's really about this idea about the inextricable links that exist. And so within these inextricable links, there's an ongoing exchange. And so a lot of my work revolves around climate adaptive design. Oh, am I losing? Can you guys follow me? Let me know if there's difficulty with slides. I'm getting some.
Yeah, the sound is, it's not the slides. It's the sound. We can hear you, but you sound like a robot.
Okay, we were right here. We were talking about how there's inextricable links. And so, you know, the question is how, when we think about these things, how do we work in a way where we can engage both the human side of the equation and the environmental side of it when we talk about social ecological systems? And is there an opportunity for us to be doing more if we think this way? And so this is actually a bit of a video of my students doing a design model. And I guess there's really a number of issues we confront when we talk about climate change. The first one is climate change itself. It's real. It's something that's coming to every city. And in some places we're already experiencing impacts. And so that's a huge problem that we have to confront when we think about climate change and climate adaptation, especially when we work in social ecological systems. The second part is that climate change is radically changing how and where cities will be in the future, particularly along waterfronts and other locations. This is a huge issue. And thirdly, this can be really depressing, and it's confusing, and it's hard to know what to do. And many people throw up their hands, and we all have pressures that we focus on in the day-to-day. Sometimes it is about your computer not working very well, but there's other things that are very significant in our lives that make it hard to focus on the future. And so the question becomes, when we work in the design studio, how can design help turn a negative, something that is challenging and frustrating, into a positive? And that's really where we like to spend our work. And so these students were developing a model for how we might actually reconfigure part of Kingston to address some of those flood issues. And so I think the first thing we got to talk about is we hear a lot of this term resilience. A number of you, I'm sure, have heard recently this term used quite a bit in different settings. And I became really interested in this notion of resilience, and I became very concerned and interested in the issues having to do with climate change when we had hurricanes Irene and Sandy and Lee that were impacting my town and other towns out there. And so I became really interested in the theory of resilience to understand actually what it means. And I'm going to share 3 basic theories of resilience because they're really, I think resilience can mean a lot of different things to different people. And so going back to some of those resilience theorists and some of the basic stuff that I talked about earlier on, there's 3 real kinds of resilience I want to share today. The first is this idea of engineering resilience. I wrote in here the capacity to resist change and return to a single equilibrium state. Sometimes I think of this as a levee next to a city that's in between a river and a city. And if the river floods, the water rises and the levee keeps that water from entering in the city, and then the water goes back down again. And the city is able to go upon its daily duties or its daily cycles in ways that are entirely unchanged by what is with respect to the flooding. It's something it can go about its own business that way without really thinking about changing. There are risks associated with levees. We call those residual risks, where if it could catastrophically fail and flood, but that's one way you can look at resilience. The second one is about ecological resilience. And this is actually where some of the basis of ecosystem thinking came from with respect to resilience. It's this idea about introducing sufficient complexity into a system so that after a disturbance, that system, in this case, an ecological system, and sort of the basis for the theory, but you can think of other systems too, has the ability to reorganize and maintain its key functions. And so when I think about this, I think about a pollinator. Let's just say there's a species of flower that must be pollinated. Maybe it's an early spring flower, a spring ephemeral that may bloom in woods that you have near your house. And it must be in late April or May. And let's just say May for the purposes of conversation. If there are 5 pollinators that are out at that time, in 2 of those pollinators, there's a disease that they're impacted by, there's still 3 pollinator species left to provide that pollination service. In a much more simplified system, if there were only 1 or 2 or 3 species of pollinators to pollinate that plant, if those were damaged by or lost due to disease or some other casualty, that would result in the inability for that ecosystem to provide that service. And so we can think about ecological resilience in terms of complexity. And then there's social ecological resilience, where I'd like to spend most of my time today. And it's about this notion of, I actually oversimplified this definition from what it was in the resilience theory literature. I had to read this article about 6 times before I really got it. I will say it here: bridging paired systems with greater capacity for adaptation and/or transformation via learning and self-organization, in addition to the ability to persist. And so this is that idea, is essentially is that we can be sufficiently complex, we can be physically and ecologically resilient. But one thing we can also take advantage of is the communities of people within which we live. We have the ability to learn, we have the ability to observe, we have the ability to learn from mistakes we made, and also prepare ahead. And so when we think about resilience, we can think about the physical ecological dimension of it, but we also should be thinking about the social, sociocultural aspects of resilience. If we're not, we're really only working with half of the opportunity in my mind's eye. And so it's this idea that humans have the ability to reorganize and provide new ways of thinking on top of what we do physically. And so it's basically around this idea that if we can build community capacity, adaptive capacity in our networks in terms of how we think about climate adaptation, that will allow us to have greater physical and ecological capacity, and vice versa. And then that will therefore support that adaptive capacity of the communities that benefit from that. And so in some ways, I view design, our act of working with communities of people when we do our work, really is an act that can change both mindsets and perspectives and community knitting, as well as change landscapes and make new landscapes and new urban fabrics that provide these benefits. And so really that was the birth of the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, this notion that we can be working with both people and place to inspire change. How can we catalyze interest, awareness, and action for adaptation has been a real goal of ours. And so I won't get to spend much time on this slide. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly, but you'll see that I worked early in Ithaca and Syracuse on this idea without sort of getting the nuts and bolts together, and then invited in communities to engage with us in the design studio. Students in the studio that were learning, people like me, faculty that had some research goals, and then communities that were interested in these questions and wanted to see a path forward. And so you may recognize some of those cities. And most of our work has been based in the Hudson River estuary. It's an incredible place. I know many of you have visited, if not all of you are well familiar with the Hudson River estuary. It has tremendous biodiversity. One of the Native American tribes that lived in this area in the bioregion called the Hudson River the Mahawkentuck, and loosely translated, that means the river that flows both ways. Actually, this river is such a shallow slope, and it's connected to the ocean down in the New York, New Jersey harbor. As many of you already know, it actually is tidally influenced, meaning the tides go up this river for over 150 miles all the way up to the federal dam at Troy. And so what that means is you have fresh water coming down through the Catskills, or well, through areas to the north in the Adirondacks and other watersheds, the Mohawk and other watersheds draining into this river. And you also have the influence of the ocean coming from the south. And so you have salt water, and you have fresh water, and you have brackish water in between. And what this means is that some of the rarest habitats in the world exist in this place. Freshwater tidal habitats, places that are primarily freshwater, but also are tidally influenced, are globally some of the rarest and most unusual places in the world. And you get incredible biodiversity from that. Many types of wetlands and species that count on them, and also all kinds of species of wildlife. There's actually seahorses in the Hudson, which continues to blow my mind. And on top of that, you have a community of people that also has a sense of connectivity to the river, an appreciation for the river, and an interest in terms of what the river has done with it and for it in the past, and also what it could mean in the future as we have these changing sea levels. One thing about the tidal influence of the ocean is not only is it subject to the tides, this area is also subject to surge from storms, as well as sea level rise over the years. And so I won't be able to show all this video, but I want to just kind of, this is a video that is really basically a model we put together and put it into Google Earth so that communities in the city of Kingston could see what the impacts of sea level rise would be in the 2080s on their site. We worked in 3 locations. That was Kingston 1, Kingston 2, and Kingston 3. This was that first area we worked in a park inland up the Rondout. And then we went and also worked in a place by Punkaki, which is a neighborhood just to the sort of towards the mouth of it, where the water treatment plant and other things were at risk. The water that you see there in blue is really what that sea level rise impact would be. And then in those kinds of places and people that would be impacted by that. So that was a neighborhood setting where sea level rise is projected to be a significant threat to the future of this waterfront. And then also, lastly, I won't go through this whole slideshow, but the place that some of you may know as Kingston Point Park, which is also at the mouth of the Rondout there, and one of the few places you can actually swim in the Hudson. And so Kingston is very interested in this and has been working quite closely to address some of these issues through retrofits and through long-term planning. And we had a great run working with that city for 3 studios in a row. And so our goal in the studio really is about building a culture of adaptation, I like to say sometimes, one municipality at a time. This notion of linking the studio with municipalities to envision more resilient and connected waterfront areas, students in our studio, as well as members of the community talking about those issues. And then combining some of these issues for economic growth with climate science to inspire cities to thrive by acting now. We have 3 meetings, and one of the first meetings we have, we actually tell, I ask 2 questions. I ask with municipalities we work with, what are your concerns about climate change? And then also, what is your vision for what you'd like your city to become? Because both of those things are things that we need to be thinking about when we work into the future. And so perhaps we can have a dialogue about one of those, and perhaps we can have a dialogue about both of those, but all of those are interlinked. And so this is really where we can engage. The other thing, we benefit greatly from participating with communities and municipalities and stakeholders, but we also hope that stakeholders benefit from this process by interacting with one another and building some of that adaptive capacity by having these kinds of conversations within the community. And so the program essentially runs like this. We have communities of people where we have city staff and neighbors, businesses, non-governmental organizations that have concerns about their waterfront or interests in their future. We work with the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a key partner of ours that includes ecologists, climate outreach specialists, policy and permitting experts, and then ourselves in the design studio, this course that we take where students are working 10 hours a week. I'm with them 9 hours a week actually in this class, and they work about around 2 times as much outside of the studio. The faculty, some of my other research staff, and most importantly for those that I'm working with on the studio side is the students, the seniors, the graduate students that are out there. And so it's really about a process of asking those questions, developing sets of design ideas and learning from those communities, taking that work back to the studio, developing some initial design concepts and going back down to that city and meeting with people and sharing some of those initial design ideas we have for their waterfront, taking information we learned, what we missed, what we learned we could add, things that people enjoyed, that they liked, that they were attracted to, go back to the studio up at Cornell once again and refine our drawings. And when we're finally finished, we go back again for a 3rd visit down to a municipality, for example, Kingston, like I mentioned, or Piermont, or City of Hudson, Ossining, where we were recently, and then share our work in a final open house. So on that bottom right is an image of me with some of the students and one of my research fellows doing that.
Gosh, about 5 more minutes.
Okay, great, I can do that. And so the first thing, there's a number of things we've learned along the way. And there's a lot, none of this is rocket science, but I thought I'd share a few conclusions we've been able to draw, and all these drawings are by students that have done them. The first one, and I can't see the heading the way it's set up here, but I think it says, if you're going to design a waterfront, you should design a waterfront. That's our first principle. We need to maximize the value of what a waterfront can be. And what designing a waterfront means is taking advantage of the fact that you're on the water. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen parking lots or garages, or in some cases, historically, places where, yards or other things were left. They really don't take advantage of the fact that they're on the water. And so what we try to do is encourage water enhanced uses on the waterfront, or water dependent uses, and the water independent uses perhaps could be going somewhere else in the long term. And so especially when we have threats of climate risk. The second thing is about designing for flooding. This notion of working with water may actually be better than working against it. Sure, levees are a possibility, and sometimes they're unavoidable when it, in certain cases where there's heavy infrastructure, like a wastewater plant or other things where it's very costly to move it. We can also create ways to retrofit our work to create flood-adapted landscapes or flood-adapted structures, and flood-adapted architecture, to allow water in, but also allow it to leave. One of my favorite stories is about a incredible barbecue restaurant that was flooded during Hurricane Sandy in Kingston. They had already retrofitted their work with radiant floors that had radiant heat and put all their electrical outlets up higher and several feet in the air instead of down low, or many of us have them in our houses. And so when it flooded, that floor was graded to let the water leave the place, and the radiant heat was turned on, and 24 hours later, they were back open for business. So these are things you can do to be flood adapted. And you can also, may also be a need for strategic relocation as well, and thinking about what is the most prudent. This slide is actually a little bit dated. I think it says design for community. We actually design with community. And it's this idea that we really need to design waterfronts that are useful for people, the people that are there. And what that means is we need to know what people's visions for their own waterfronts are. I've seen many plans, many designs, many ideas that really have gone on a shelf because those that were working on it didn't really consult the needs and interests and the expertise, frankly, of those in the community. And so often for us, it changes with every community, but we found that universal access for neighbors, possibly for visitors, is really important. And also these waterfronts should be memorable. They should be an asset to these cities from the beginning. The fourth one is about designing with nature. This idea that a healthy Hudson is good for us and for the greater ecology. We can create places that enhance the sensitive ecosystems in the Hudson, and we also can take advantage of those services that those ecosystems provide. And so by working in this way, we can find new ways of leveraging ecological function to help our waterfronts become the wonderful places we'd like them to be. And then the last one, I think this one says design for change. Again, no rocket science here, but this idea that we should really be building value into waterfronts as they change over time. This notion that we need to, a waterfront is often a key part of a city. It's an important part of it. It needs to be important today. And it also needs to be important in the future with some of these flood changes and these inundation changes that are happening. That's critical, that it has value throughout its future. But secondly, we need to find ways to phase this work in. There's great examples of mega cities doing massive retrofits in short amount of time. But in the 85 cities in the Hudson, there's really relatively few that have those resources. And so we need to find ways to phase that work in over time. And so the studio sort of sits in between two things. The DEC has over 20 years, the Hudson River Estuary Program, building relationships and knowledge and outreach structures that are out there. The studio, we step in, we know that there's interest. We hope to inspire communities to adapt. And then we work with DEC afterward, although DEC takes the lead on integrating these ideas and providing opportunities for action. And it's the whole idea about building capacity, both socioculturally as well as ecophysically. And so a few last thoughts. This idea that in cities our work is ecologically and socially linked, and we need to work with both. Sometimes I feel people are interested in the designs we create, but sometimes and that's the product that I think about sometimes. But sometimes I feel like our process may actually be more valuable because of the capacity it builds into the work that the municipality is doing. People are talking about these issues amongst themselves, and we hope that that's helpful. We learn about engagement effectiveness. We also develop new technologies for adaptation. And I do think that every project is an opportunity to work towards a more adaptive future for both people and the greater ecology. We actually do have a letter of interest open right now for our work that's going to be in fall 2021. We do plan on having a fully engaged climate adaptive design studio. If you're interested, I can send this link to Hanford Mills. Most of our work is spent on Hudson River waterfronts. And some of you may be from that area or know others that are there. And if there is interest, we'd love to hear from you and see how opportunities may arise between what you're interested in doing and what we can help with. And so it's about building a culture of adaptation in the bioregion. And I think that that's all I have.
Josh, thank you very much. That was wonderful. And what a nice juxtaposition to Richard's presentation, kind of urban and rural stewardship. Sorry, Will, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's okay. No, you go, Liz, if you.
I'm done.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was thinking too that these presentations paired really well, even though they were quite different from one another. The thing that jumped out to me, of course, as a historian, is continuity and change, right? So, Richard, your practice is so rooted in this place, not only really over your own lifetime, but generations of your family's lives in this place. And Josh, you were talking about adapting to change. But I think embedded in that is this awareness, the connections between past, present, and future. Right. So I guess one thing that I would love to hear more about is the history, right? How some of the history might inform, whether that's ecological history, environmental history, or some of the social and cultural history informs your design work and also, your artistic practice, Richard.
Would you like to start with that, Richard?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I can start. I think that's a really great point you make, Will. And actually one of the first things we do, I didn't get into our full process in the studio, but we really spend a considerable amount of time studying the hydrology and the ecosystems and all kinds of things. But one thing that I think is really important to understand a place, and we had a short conversation about this earlier, you need to understand the history, and in many cases, the prehistory, all cases, really the prehistory of a place to understand how the landscape works and what it once did. And so our students actually do study that. And every year, I have several students that are inspired by the past as sort of a way of providing a springboard towards future design ideas. And I find that to be especially critical because every future becomes a past and we continue to build on those things. Did you have anything you wanted to add, Richard?
The Catskills region is in a very interesting place right now that we're more aware of because of the COVID pandemic. And it seems like an opportunity to look at its history. Incidentally, Michael Kudish, The Catskill Forest and Its History, is a wonderful book that I recommend to you all. In addition to studying that history, I think we ought to be looking at the dairy industry, and we ought to be looking at land changes that have been occurring rather rapidly over the last 20 years. That is, property lines changing and whatever. And I think we can save it. That is, by informing people, including the new owners, and informing ourselves. We can do something. I'm wondering, I'm just thinking, can we do it as a Hanford Mills, start with a Hanford Mills program and Cornell?
Keith and I were texting back and forth saying, oh, we've got to get involved in this.
Yes.
And I know that Josh talks a lot about the role that they play in urban areas, but we've been shaped by our floods, and our built environment is something we're really trying to think about, trying to maintain in the face of these superstorms and the changes that we're encountering. So it might not be an urban area where thousands of people are trying to live and figure out what their next century is going to look like, but we certainly want to protect our resources in a similar way and think about how that happens. And I think it goes beyond the mill, like you said, Richard. And that is really important for any of us who have been around here for the mere 30 years I've been in this neighborhood versus the few more years you've been around, Richard, watching the changes in the landscape and the changes as stewardship patterns that happen as farms go out and property ownership changes is really something that would be nice to address in a kind of thoughtful way in terms of that continuity and that sense of place.
Yeah, and there's a question in the Q&A that I think maybe kind of bridges this a little bit. So it says, Josh is focused on the threat of rising water along the coast. What do you feel are the threats to the forest? I think both of you could, I mean, it's sort of directed at Richard, but I think both could answer that question.
Of course, invasive species of all varieties, plant and animal. That's an extreme threat. Like, I'm thinking of the threat to the forest that was presented and is presented by the emerald ash borer, where it was coming in from the Hudson. That is, it was doing what invasive species do. They gain more territory. And landowners began cutting all their ash trees. Thinking, okay, we'll just, and then somebody came along and said, don't cut anything. See which ash trees survive and perhaps have some kind of immunity. So I'm just using that as an example, a recent example of as an entire region, we need to address CRISP, which is that agency within the Catskill Center for Conservation and Development that is addressing the invasive species. And we should join and give opinion as well as membership.
Yeah, you know, I guess I think threats are real in climate change, and the impacts of them are really important to be mindful of. I sometimes think also about the opportunities. You mentioned, Richard, the you know, to see which members of a forest stand may have greater resistance to the emerald ash borer. I don't know about that particular disease very well, so I don't know the specifics of it and how these things can work. But sometimes when we talk about biodiversity, we think of diversity of species, but really that's only part of it. From the standpoint of ecological resilience, we can think about biodiversity. And if you look at the definition of it as it's evolved over the years, it's diversity, not only of species, but genetic diversity, as well as connectedness of these systems to one another and the different ecosystems that are within a biodiverse self. So all of those things point to the potential to have complexity, and perhaps rural areas have some of that complexity in the forest. You mentioned, how do we deal with the threats of the forest? A complex forest has an opportunity to reorganize and provide those services that we count on, but also many of the species that are in there. I would also add on the sociocultural side, on the social dimension, I actually started out more in rural planning and design, and I was more of a rural scientist. I worked in very remote places, and I've found in many places I've worked, and you may know about this in your communities, that the fabric of many rural communities is very strong. And so how can we leverage that culture, that network of people to improve our own adaptive capacity as we confront some of the threats and impacts of climate change? That's another way of thinking about it and how those two things come
In a
together.
very good way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think this is another connection here. Both of you are describing working landscapes and talking about the value of the farmers, in your case, Richard, and the cows, the dairy farms. And I think when I think about the Hudson River, I think about all of the history of industry in those spaces and people who have worked in those spaces. And now, of course, those industries, especially the Hudson River, have done a lot of damage, a lot of pollution, but there's also understanding of the environment that comes through working the land, and that kind of close, intimate knowledge. My students do oral histories with farmers, and I've learned so many things about this region, Otsego County, Delaware County, from listening to these farmers. And it's not just about the nuts and bolts of farming. It's very much about the land. It's about the flora and fauna and how things, have changed over time. And some things have gotten worse and some things have gotten better.
And there's a new voice in the discussion for the last decade plus is Peter Volblade, however you say his name, Wohlleben, who's the author of The Hidden Life of Trees. It's extraordinary how he puts together the research that plant scientists are doing to talk about how plants communicate and have their communities within the forest. So I recommend, and he's on my the list that I published with this slideshow. Peter Wohlleben, The Hidden Life of Trees, and he has a number of books out now.
And I think that, two of the things that were just said, and thank you for mentioning that book, Richard, it is really special. Of course, we love everything about wooden trees here at Hanford Mills, but the tying it together with what Will said about learning from our local farmers and not losing that knowledge that they have as our communities change, and how to keep this fabric knitted together. Delaware County is in a time, it has been for decades, but certainly even more now with the pandemic, as farms go out, as property changes hands. How do you not lose that local knowledge that those farmers represent? And how do you leverage that and build community with the new and the old, and build these bridges and learn from this long kind of deeply rooted information? And that's one of the things that Hanford Mills always tries to do, pointing to the history of the region and the history of resource use and the role of resources, both natural and agricultural, and then trying to make those connections to our lives today. and ideally to build that community and to build bridges of understanding of the rural agricultural communities of our past and the changing communities of our present.
And I'm thinking about the social resources of young people. Some farmers can't find enough help to do their jobs of producing food to take to urban centers. We're dependent mostly on that, what do we want to call that, food corporate structure that provides food to many of us.
Business.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking of the young people as a resource rather than thinking or electing to depart for something exciting. Maybe there's something exciting here for them to stay for. I certainly, when I was 18, I said, get me out of here. But I was back rather soon.
And in the Catskills too, I mean, we're in a very rural area, but we're deeply connected to urban centers, especially farther south into the Catskills. Richard mentioned that line between the Susquehanna watershed, which is part of the Chesapeake Bay larger watershed, and the Delaware. And the Delaware River is part of the New York City watershed. And because of the forests in the Catskills and the way that they're able to filter that water from here is able to help provide water for New York City, which is critical for 9 million people. So we're really talking too about being connected to in terms of food and in terms of water. There's a lot of connections back and forth, and it really is important for both kinds of ecosystems to be thriving.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another, theme that has been consistent across this whole series is really process, right? We have art. We've been pairing artists and scholars who do community engaged work in a lot of cases, and of course Hanford Mills too. You have a process. I, as a historian collaborating with you, we have a process, and so as we're thinking through listening to generations, trying to understand, absorb, synthesize some of that wisdom and help to, in Josh's case, build a climate resilient future. In some cases with our communities around here, just to help them survive, what are some of the effective processes, practices that we can engage in? I mean, you laid out briefly, Josh, your 3 meetings in the process, but I am curious a little more to learn a little more about what the conversations are like, and Richard too. I'm always fascinated by the artistic process, which seemed in the way you described it to be solitary, which makes sense. But then you also alluded to community connections and family connections that seem to be important as well in your work and your process.
Yeah, maybe I could start with that. I think a lot about process. I mentioned the importance of it. I think, I mentioned that 3-step, there are only so many slides I could have. And so I mentioned the 3-step process. We actually do have a slide on that. But during this process, we have several ways that people can engage. I found that different people are comfortable speaking in different venues. We'll have a single, for that first event, we have a large meeting where many people are talking amongst many other people together. But then we have lunch, and there's one-on-one conversations that happen there, 2-on-2 conversations that happen there that are much more intimate, and some people are more comfortable kind of having conversations there. And then we also have a workshop type process that we work in, where we come with ideas and people can react in small groups. And so that's another way we can talk about process. And then finally, we do have this open house where instead of having a big presentation that's all one way, people can go from student project to student project and have a conversation. And I think it's really important. The diversity of ways we engage at the community level is been really critical to our process. Another thing we've learned is about if we really want to be diverse, we really need to invite folks to the conversation that are diverse. And so I mentioned the businesses and the NGOs and the community members and the city staff, but we're also thinking about different scales of influence that people have: a small business, a large business on a waterfront, or an agency that's might be a city agency and county agencies and state agencies. And then also neighbors that represent maybe individuals or represent a larger organization or sit on a council representing a larger neighborhood. And so all of these people bring different knowledge, different strengths to the table. And so what that does is that provides an opportunity to sort of use that material, to access that material, to become more adaptable, to become more resilient. And I think the last thing I'd say is we use a theory called bonding, bridging, and linking. It's a theory by Harrison et al. If others are interested, I can send a short article about it. Bonding is the things that happen between like people that might be operating, have the same scale of influence in the same sector. Perhaps two neighbors talking amongst each other. That's a way of building capacity or networking. Bridging is a way where we can bridge across types of people. Someone who may work in a city agency is talking to a business owner. Somebody who is in an NGO for an environmental organization is talking to a developer. And that allows an interaction that's much, much different in bridging. And then finally, linking is linking across those scales within a similar sector, be that private, public, academic, to operate across scales there. And what that does is you can imagine all of those threads of community that you build together that way. And that's been one way we've approached our process, to try to optimize that, to try to find that richness within a community and ask folks to join in the conversation.
I think that's a wonderful structure, the bridging, bonding, and linking. Let's start here.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead, Will.
I was just going to, one more observation is that, that process involves drawing, what you described, all the pictures. So it is art, right? I mean, design is art, and the art is a way for people to have a conversation, right? It once it can be visualized, you'd say, oh, okay, I get it now. And let's talk about that, right? And it's the same with a painting, right? I mean, it opens up, good art, great art opens up conversations.
Right, and the CAD plans that I had seen of Josh and his students are very exciting to look at, and nice to have those, shall we say, prepared through study and then shared.
Yeah, as a point, another linkage point as well. One thing that I deeply appreciate, Richard, is your sharing of your process drawings, your early drawings, and the iterations that get you to what you might consider to be the final part of that exercise. Design is sort of a combination of art and science, and I'm always encouraging my students to share these process drawings. We can learn from them. They learn themselves, but others do too, in terms of your intent and your goals. And it's truly tremendous to see that progression. I really enjoyed that, Richard.
Process drawings are sometimes the most exciting. I'd often choose that over a finished drawing. For example, a relative was applying to Pratt Institute. This was some years ago. And I said, let me choose them for you. I'm a Pratt MFA, and I looked at his drawings, and I recommend sending the process drawings that he, as a young student, a young art student, had sent or prepared.
Absolutely.
So process drawings.
It's kind of interesting because is it ever really done? Do you ever, I know you finish pieces of work and your students finish projects and present them, but this conversation goes on and on about every community and visualizing the next change and representing the next change. And each, we were talking about this before this program went live, every day you look out at the same place and it looks different. And so there's always a new iteration that becomes part of that process.
Sometimes say design is never done. We just run out of time. You know, you can always improve on it.
And
It's kind of like a museum exhibit, though. You got to get it up on the wall.
That's right.
It's got to be done.
Yep.
I was gonna say,
Got to be finished. And you know, it is. I do encourage in my studios for people to do iterative work, to share what they have at the moment, so we can react to it and learn from it, and then move on to the next. And so that's really, really important.
Yes, agreed.
and the work your students are doing, Josh, is really, really beautifully creative artwork, as well as creative problem solving.
My hope is that in addition to helping address some of the issues that people are confronting, we can find new ways of looking at a problem or a question to advance thinking in new ways. And we're always looking to try to find a balance between practical and innovative in our work. And I think that that's really important. Practical and visionary, shall we say.
Ironic that it parallels what happened at Hanford Mills, which was a lot of practical innovation too.
Well, I think that's a great note to to wrap up our conversation. Practical innovation. Maybe that's the message or the theme of the next series, right?
Yeah.
Picking
Or
up.
innovative practice. I like that too.
Yeah. You could do a slash.
I see a circle.
Yeah, it's a circle. Yeah.
Oh, this has been a lovely conversation, and I appreciate our audience's patience with our technical difficulties, but Josh, you really zigged and zagged and got back on track very quickly. Thank you, and thanks to both of you for all of the great insights and for everything you've shared. I think it's really come together really nicely, and it's been a great way to end this portion of our interaction series, the first chapter. We hope to have many more. And
Well,
really
yeah, we
appreciate
got
it.
one question here, Liz,
Oh,
for
sure.
you under the wire. Nice concluding question. What do you hope Hanford Mills will gain from this series as you look back over the entire series?
I hope that we have a better understanding of our capacity to explore these different issues that we've begun to talk about as an organization, as a bigger community, and can begin to take more steps to build on the conversations that have started and continue to have dialogues with people in our community and farther who are doing great work and helping through those conversations to bridge the past and the present, the challenges we face today, and think about how we learn from our past and move forward with these challenges.